All right, let's dive into the immortal life of Henrietta Lacks.
Okay.
We've got a really fascinating set of excerpts here that you've provided for this deep dive.
Yeah.
And I think it's going to be quite a journey exploring the science, the ethics, and the very human story behind one of the most important scientific discoveries
Absolutely.
of our time.
And I think that's what makes it so compelling, is that it takes us beyond the science and into the lives that were forever changed by it.
Yeah, it really does. And it all starts with Henrietta Lacks, a young black woman who died from cervical cancer in 1951.
Right.
But her story, it doesn't end there, in fact.
It doesn't.
In many ways, that's really where it begins.
That's where it begins because during her treatment, doctors took a sample of her tumor.
Right.
And without her knowledge or consent, those cells became the first immortal human cell line known as HeLa.
Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit. We hear immortal cell line,
Right.
but what does that actually mean?
It means that unlike normal cells, which eventually die, HeLa cells can divide and multiply indefinitely in a lab setting.
And why is that such a big deal? I mean, cell science, but why should I care?
Well, think of it this way. Before HeLa scientists really struggled to grow human cells in the lab, it was a huge roadblock to medical research. But suddenly with HeLa, they had this readily available and robust cell line that they could use for all sorts of experiments.
So it's like unlocking this whole new world of possibilities for scientific discovery.
Exactly. And the book really dives into the specific ways that HeLa cells revolutionized research.
Let's go back to that moment when HeLa was born. The book describes this scene with this young lab assistant named Mary Kubitschek, a tuna salad sandwich.
Yeah. Dr. George Gailey, who is a brilliant scientist, but a little bit eccentric, had been trying to grow human cells and culture for years. And it was Mary working in his lab who successfully cultured Henrietta's cells.
And it's amazing to think that this discovery, which would change the world, happened in a lab that he basically built himself from salvaged equipment.
Yeah, he was incredibly dedicated and resourceful.
Wow.
He and his wife, Margaret, really poured their hearts and souls into that lab.
So while he's making scientific history, Henrietta Lacks is fighting for her life,
Yes.
ultimately losing that battle. And this is where I think the ethical dilemmas really come to the forefront.
Absolutely. At the time, there was no concept of informed consent for tissue research.
Right.
Henrietta never knew her cells had been taken, and her family wasn't informed until years later.
Can you imagine finding out years after your mother's death
Right.
that her cells were alive and being used in labs all over the world?
It's really hard to fathom.
Yeah.
The book really captures the shock and anger of the Lacks family when they finally learn about HeLa.
And they never received any financial compensation for the use of her cells, even though they became incredibly valuable commercially.
Right.
I mean, this raises so many questions about, who owns our cells?
Absolutely.
What rights do we have over our own biological material?
Huge question.
It's issues that we're still grappling with today.
Big time.
So we've got Henrietta's story, which is this tragic and deeply personal story.
Yeah.
And then we have the story of HeLa, which is this scientific marvel that is impacting millions of lives.
Yes.
And the book does such a brilliant job of weaving these two narratives together.
It does.
So let's talk about the impact of HeLa. I mean, we know these cells were important,
Right.
but how did they actually change things?
Well, for starters, HeLa cells were crucial in the development of the polio vaccine.
Okay, now we're talking life-saving breakthroughs.
Exactly before HeLa, scientists had to use live monkeys to test the polio vaccine,
Wow.
which was expensive and dangerous. But HeLa cells could be grown in massive quantities, providing a safe and efficient way to test the vaccine.
So in a way, Henrietta Lacks played a role in eradicating one of the most devastating diseases
She did.
of the 20th century.
It's a truly remarkable contribution.
Yeah.
And that's just one example.
Wow.
HeLa cells were also essential in developing methods for freezing cells.
Freezing cells, why is that important?
Well, this allowed scientists to preserve and ship cells, which just revolutionized cell culture research. It's like going from having to bake bread from scratch every time to having frozen dough ready to go.
Oh, I get it. It made research much easier and more efficient.
Absolutely. And there's more. HeLa cells help scientists discover the correct number of chromosomes in human cells.
Wait, didn't we already know that?
Surprisingly, no. Before HeLa, there was actually debate among scientists about the exact number.
Wow.
Henrietta's cells provided that definitive answer, which was a major step forward in understanding human genetics.
It's incredible to think that these cells taken without consent ended up being the key to solving so many scientific mysteries.
I know, it's amazing.
Yeah.
And the breakthroughs continues. HeLa has been used in countless cancer studies, drug development research, and even sent to space to study the effects of zero gravity on human cells.
I mean, come on, it doesn't get much cooler than that.
It's pretty amazing.
But amid all this progress, there was also this major hiccup.
What was it called? The HeLa bomb.
The HeLa bomb, yes. And in the 1960s, a geneticist named Stanley Gartler discovered that HeLa cells were so robust, so good at growing, that they had actually contaminated many other cell lines being used in labs around the world.
Wait, so all these scientists were doing research thinking they were studying one type of cell?
Right.
But it was actually HeLa all along.
Precisely, and this contamination invalidated years of research.
Wow.
It was a huge setback for the scientific community.
So HeLa, this incredible scientific gift, also had a bit of a mischievous side,
Yes.
throwing a wrench into the works
A little bit of a prankster.
of scientific research.
That's right.
Now, while HeLa's out there changing the world,
Right.
Henrietta's children are growing up completely unaware of their mother's contribution to science.
Yeah.
And that's where Rebecca Lacks,
Yes.
Henrietta's daughter, comes into this story.
That's right.
The book describes her journey to uncover the truth about her mother and her sister Elsie, who had a particularly heartbreaking story.
Deborah became obsessed with understanding what happened to her mother and her sister.
She did.
She was terrified of inheriting cancer,
Right.
angry at the lack of consent, and desperate to honor her mother's memory.
Absolutely.
Her search for answers leads her to Crownsville Hospital Center where Elsie had died.
Yes, and it's through Deborah's eyes that we get this glimpse into the horrific conditions at Crownsville,
Yeah.
a mental institution where Elsie was essentially abandoned.
It's a stark reminder, I think, of the injustices faced by African Americans.
Yeah,
especially those with disabilities during that era.
absolutely.
And it adds another layer of tragedy
It does.
to this already complex legacy of Henrietta Lacks.
So we've got this incredible scientific discovery, ethical dilemmas, a family searching for answers.
Right.
And then there's this whole other dimension to the story, the
Yeah.
religious interpretations of HeLa's immortality.
That's right. Some members of the Lacks family, deeply rooted in their faith, believe that Henrietta was chosen by God for a specific purpose. Right. They see the immortality of her cells as a sign of divine intervention,
Yes.
connecting it to this belief in this spiritual body.
It's a fascinating example of how personal beliefs can shape our understanding of science and the world around us.
It reminds us that there are often multiple ways of interpreting events,
Absolutely.
especially those that intersect with science and faith.
And that there's so much more to uncover in this remarkable story.
Yeah, and we will be back to uncover more.
Yes, we will. Welcome back to our deep dive into the immortal life of Henrietta Lacks. Before the break, we were discussing the multiple layers of this story.
Yeah.
The scientific breakthroughs, the ethical questions,
Right.
and the profound impact on the Lacks family.
It's a story that really keeps unfolding the more you learn about it. And one of the things that really stood out to me was how Henrietta Lacks' story became this catalyst for this much larger conversation about tissue ownership and informed consent in research.
Absolutely. Her case, even though it happened decades ago, really brought those crucial issues into the public spotlight.
The book talks about several legal cases that grapple with these questions, like the Moore v. Regents of the University of California case.
Right.
Can you tell us a little bit about that one?
Yeah, so in that case, a man named John Moore sued his doctor
Okay.
because the doctor had developed this lucrative cell line from Moore's tissues without his consent.
So kind of similar to the Lacks family situation, except that John Moore was aware
Right.
his cells were being used.
Right, and the court actually ruled against Moore, stating that patients don't have property rights to their discarded tissues.
Wow, that's a tough ruling. So
Yeah.
even if your cells are used to create something incredibly valuable,
Right.
you have no legal claim to it.
That was the court's decision, and it raised a lot of concerns about potential exploitation,
Yeah.
especially for vulnerable patients.
It really makes you think about the balance between, encouraging scientific progress
Right.
and protecting individual rights.
It's a complex issue, and the book doesn't pretend to have all the answers,
Right.
but it does a fantastic job of presenting different perspectives and encouraging us to think critically about these ethical dilemmas.
The debate about financial compensation for tissue donors is another big piece of this puzzle.
Many people argue that if researchers or companies are profiting from cell lines derived from someone's tissues, that those individuals or their families should receive some form of compensation.
That seems fair, especially when you consider that the Lacks family has struggled financially,
Right.
while HeLa has generated significant revenue for various companies.
However, there are also concerns that financial incentives could create this market for tissues
Yeah.
and potentially lead to exploitation.
I can see how that could become a slippery slope.
Right.
So what's the solution?
There are no easy answers, and it's a debate that continues to this day.
Yeah.
But The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks provides this valuable context
Right.
for understanding the different viewpoints and challenges that we face.
It definitely leaves you with more questions than answers, but in a good way.
Right.
It makes you realize how important these conversations are.
Absolutely. And ultimately, I think Henrietta Lacks' story serves as this powerful reminder of the importance of ethical practices in research.
And the need for transparency and informed consent. We can't forget that behind every scientific breakthrough,
Yes.
there are human stories.
Absolutely.
And we have a responsibility to honor those stories.
Especially the stories of individuals from marginalized communities whose contributions have often been overlooked or exploited.
One of the things that really struck me about this book was the way that it brought those stories to life.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't just about the science.
Right.
It was about the people.
And the author, Rebecca Skloot,
Yeah.
did an incredible job of weaving together the science, the history, and these personal narratives.
She spent years building relationships with the Lacks family,
She did.
earning their trust and allowing their voices to be heard.
And that's such a crucial aspect of the book.
Yeah.
It ensures that Henrietta Lacks isn't just a scientific specimen, but a human being
Right.
whose life and legacy continue to impact her family and the world.
This deep dive has been incredibly eye-opening for me. I'm already thinking about so many things differently, especially when it comes to the ethics of scientific research.
It's a testament to the power of the book.
Yeah.
It challenges us to think critically about the advancements that we celebrate
Right.
and the individuals who often go unrecognized.
Henrietta Lacks' cells have undoubtedly changed the world, but her story reminds us that scientific progress should always be accompanied by ethical considerations.
Yes.
And a deep respect for human dignity. And it really prompts us to kind of reflect on the responsibilities that we have as a society when it comes to scientific advancements.
It makes you realize that behind every scientific breakthrough, there's a human story, and often that story is filled with complexities and nuances.
Yeah, the book encourages us to move beyond simply celebrating the achievements and to consider the individuals and their families who may have been impacted by the research.
Right.
It's a powerful message.
It is. And speaking of powerful messages, what stood out to you about Henrietta Lacks' story?
For me, it's the remarkable resilience of the Lacks family. Despite the lack of recognition and the ethical violations that they faced, they continue to seek answers and to fight for their mother's memory.
I completely agree. Deborah's determination to learn about her mother and to understand the science behind HeLa cells is incredibly inspiring.
It's also a reminder that scientific progress doesn't always translate into social justice or equitable treatment. The book really raises so many important questions about race, class, and access to healthcare.
And it highlights the importance of ensuring that scientific advancements benefit all members of society, not just a select few.
The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks is more than just a science book. It's a human story, a testament to resilience and a call to action for greater awareness and ethical practices in research.
It's a book that challenges our assumptions, expands our understanding of the world, and leaves us pondering that complex interplay between science ethics and the human experience.
We've only scratched the surface here, and I highly encourage you to dive deeper into this compelling story yourself. You can find the affiliate link to purchase the book in the description below.
It's a book that will stay with you long after you turn the final page, prompting you to think differently about the world around you and the advancements that we often take for granted.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the immortal life of Henrietta Lacks. It's a story that has stayed with me, and I hope it has sparked your curiosity as well.
Me too.